Okay, my name is Jacob Nelson. This is part 3 of the Unit 1 essay questions. And yeah, let's just get started. So the first part, we're talking about the autonomic nervous system. And so that stems off the peripheral nervous system in our bodies, which controls the involuntary actions that our body requires, whereas it's differentiated from the somatic nervous system, which is like our muscle contractions that are voluntary to the skeletal muscles. The autonomic nervous system compares of two parts, that is the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system requires our fight or flight movements or requirements, and then the parasympathetic system requires our resting or digesting actions. The sympathetic nervous system, innervate things such as our, let's say if we were being attacked by a bear, our pupils will dilate, they'll open up more to have more vision. Our heart rate may increase. The tubes of our bronchioles in our lungs will dilate, open up so that we can breathe more through it. And so the parasympathetic nervous system will kind of act as the opposite of those innervations. Both the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous systems are run by nerves, more specifically two neurons that is both pre and post ganglionic neurons, and they will go to different parts of the body to innervate those things. For example, the sympathetic nervous system consists of two neurons, and those neurons typically release norepinephrine to the effector of the body to innervate that action, which would make it an adrenergic neuron, which is referring to the post-ganglionic neuron. Just before I move on too far, I want to say for both sympathetic and parasympathetic neurons, the first neurons of both of those systems always release acetylcholine as the neurotransmitter to that second neuron. But the second neuron of this sympathetic nervous system, like I said, is typically releasing norepinephrine or some sort of catecholamine. Other examples of that could be dopamine or epinephrine that can be released from the adrenal gland of the kidneys. And the parasympathetic system, what differentiates from the sympathetic nervous system there is that second neuron actually releases acetylcholine. So pre and post is both acetylcholine for the parasympathetic system. Another thing that differentiates the innervations are the receptors for those different neurons that I mentioned already. Typically, acetylcholine receptors are nicotinic, so that includes N1 and N2 receptors, and that also includes muscarinic receptors, which is M1 through M5. The different organs have different combination of those receptors. And the adrenergic, or anything that receives epinephrine, norepinephrine, or dopamine, includes the alpha and beta receptors. As far as I know, I think there's 2 alpha receptors and then 3 beta receptors. So for example, the eye, has a M1 receptor for acetylcholine to dilate the eye, and then an alpha-1 receptor to constrict the pupil of the eye. Depending on what parasympathetic system is at play, will depict which receptors are going to receive what neurotransmitters. I failed to mention that the origin of these parasympathetic or the autonomic system in entirety, those neurons originate from the lateral horn of the vertebral or spinal column. They all originate from there, from that lateral horn, not the anterior, not the posterior side, but that side chain. And some of them, for example, will synapse in different locations. The sympathetic nervous neurons will synapse in the sympathetic chain ganglion, which is just outside that spinal column. Once it leaves the lateral horn, it comes to that sympathetic chain ganglion, will synapse to that second neuron that I mentioned, and that second neuron will go to the effector organ and tissues. There is an exception to that, in which the parasympathetic system doesn't synapse at the sympathetic chain ganglion and actually goes through it to the collateral ganglion, which is the type of ganglion that's just anywhere outside of away from the spinal column. This could be somewhere in the abdominal cavity, thoracic cavity. Sorry, it wouldn't be in the thoracic cavity, most likely be in the abdominal cavity and such. So the parasympathetic nervous system, will innervate those things. There is a what we call a adrenal medulla neuron. This is a type of sympathetic neuron that travels from the lateral horn through the collateral ganglion, so it doesn't synapse in it. It goes through it, and above the kidneys is a adrenal gland that the neuron will go into and make a synapse with a second neuron there to release epinephrine. Another exception of a sympathetic nervous system is that we have two types of sweat glands. We have one that is general sweat glands, and then we have another one that is a localized sweat gland. This is more for when you're stressed. So this is when your palms get sweaty, your armpits, even the pubic region will start to sweat due to due to stress. So those are the innervations and actions of sympathetic and parasympathetic neurons to whatever effector that they innervate. Anything that's releasing acetylcholine is a cholinergic neuron. So like I mentioned, this is all the pre-synaptic ganglionic nerves. And then adrenergic receptors are typically referred to the sympathetic neurons that release norepinephrine or any sort of catecholamine in that matter. Let's see. So the body uses the autonomic nervous system to involuntarily control these different things for the body to function without us even thinking about it. The heart would have cardiac muscles that is innervated by sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous neurons that will either increase the heart rate or decrease it. Another example of an organ that has an exception actually is the blood vessels. So the blood vessels do not have a parasympathetic neuron to innervate it. There is no rest or digest innervation for the blood vessels in our body. It's actually just solely innervated by the sympathetic system. So that means our blood vessels only receive the adrenergic neurons that release norepinephrine to it. There's no cholinergic version because it isn't a parasympathetic pathway for that. So interesting results for that. Let's see. The lungs, same thing, except it might actually trick you to think that, you would probably want to use sympathetic system and innervate it to constrict, but that's not what you want. It doesn't actually do that, because if you're in a fight or flight situation, you want your lungs to be able to breathe in more air. So instead of constricting by exciting those things, you want to relax them so you have more space, more area for that air to flow in. A good way I remember which receptors do what, there's a pattern where you look at the odd numbers, so like alpha 1, beta 1, muscarinic 1 or 3, for example. All the odd numbers of those receptors are going to tell you that they are excitatory. So they would either constrict or increase heart rate, things like that. Whereas the even numbers are going to basically the opposite. They're going to inhibit or decrease the excitatoriness of those neurons to whatever organ it is. So for example, the lungs, like I mentioned, you're going to inhibit that excitatory response, so it's not going to constrict, but it's going to actually dilate those bronchial tubes. Or in a parasympathetic rest and digest situation, you're probably going to want your heart rate to eventually slow down from being at a high heart rate to a more manageable and restful rate, and other things like your eyes will probably start to constrict, and things like that. So yeah, one more thing to mention, the nicotinic receptors are ligand-gated receptors. They are only open once a specific ligand attaches to that channel to open for the synapse to occur, whereas the rest of them, so the muscarinic, alpha, and beta receptors, are using G proteins in order to have that cascade of effects to create that synapse to happen. So that cascade includes cyclic AMP as well as IP3. Whether you decrease it, increases, depicts on whether something is excitatory or inhibitory. So yeah, that's a brief overview. And this is about the autonomic nervous system and how those neurons will synapse, and the anatomy of them, the physiology of those systems as well. Thank you for listening.